Okay, so I'm excited about our panel because I think we're going to span from very basic science, very basic decision science, and then Barbara will bring it up to sort of more behavioral and cognitive level, and then we'll get to some of the how do you translate this into health. So my job, therefore, at the beginning is to bore you with some laboratory experiments. Well, not really bore you, hopefully not bore you, but just sort of explain some of the basis and some of the principles we think apply to understanding decision-making, cognition, and aging. Generally, in the lab, we study cognition in very basic ways and aspects of decision-making, how we behave in our world, just by breaking apart problems into very fundamental components, what we think are very fundamental components. And this is one example of a really relevant kind of question that has been very well studied in behavioral economics, decision science, and now psychology and neuroscience. This is a question from a class of choices called intertemporal choices, where you have to decide between things that can pay off now or later. And of course, if you're very patient in these kind of questions, it tends to benefit you, especially for things like retirement savings, health, right? So do you want chocolate cake now or a nice, or more health later on? These kind of impulsivity kind of questions tend to be very stereotypic within an individual. And how you answer this question, would you rather have $1,000 today or $1,200 next year, predicts a lot of things like obesity rates and health outcomes and accumulation of wealth over the lifespan. So we ask these kind of questions in the lab, and the way people behave and choose seems to be related to the function of specific neural systems. And I'm going to focus on one in particular, just as an example of one way in which aging and experience manifests as changing neural function, right? And so I thought I'd illustrate this with this one specific structure. And so the next slide I'll tell you what we know a little bit about, the kind of functions it performs. But I think Barbara hopefully will expand a little bit on this, because changes in the way the brain functions and as a consequence of learning is really true throughout everything we know about the brain. So connections that are formed between brain structures, the nature of those neurons, and so forth. So I'm just going to talk about one specific example and show you some of the consequences for that. So here's how I'm going to try to motivate what we understand about the structure with this experiment by some psychologists, Todd Maddox and Greg Ashby. And they had people you see these little crazy gradings, and you just have to say whether you think this is an A or a B. They're studying category learning. How do you learn to parse the world? It's a very esoteric kind of experiment. But they showed that depending on how you segment these stimuli into different categories, people use very different strategies. So if it's a very simple kind of rule, like if you can determine whether it's an A or B based on how thick those bars are, or whether they're more horizontal or vertical, then people will just you'll quickly figure out, okay, if it's vertical, then it's a B. If it's horizontal, it's an A. You'll just apply that. He calls that rule-based learning. The type of learning that's even more interesting, I think, is what he calls information integration. This is where you have some mixture of orientation and thickness that together tell you if it's an A or B. And people are totally clueless. They can't figure it out verbally, but you get really good at separating this. You can't express the rule verbally. You have no idea that you're actually doing it, but you're getting kind of really close to 100% correct, right? So it's called information integration. And this kind of sort of learning through experience and sort of figuring out relationships, associations between stimuli in a very abstract sense depends on a structure in our brain called the basal ganglia. This is the area of our brain that underlies things like habits and really well-learned behaviors. And the basal ganglia is really important as well for a number of decisions, as you can imagine. So picking up sort of regular relationships in our world sort of automatically and implicitly depends on the basal ganglia, but also how you choose between $1,000 today and $1,200 next year depends on the basal ganglia. This kind of, if you can imagine, if the basal ganglia learns associations leads to very automatic behaviors, then the automatic tendency to want to eat that chocolate cake is maintained by the basal ganglia, right? That's the kind of sort of automatic behavior that can arise. Your tendency to want to think about future health may be much less automatic. But what we've been studying in the lab is the change in the function of basal ganglia that occurs with experience. So if you're young, maybe the very automatic thing to do is to behave impulsively, but with experience, you sort of learn that, hey, sometimes it's good to be more patient. And then that becomes the more automatic type behavior, and you can get a shift in function of the basal ganglia through this experience, through this sort of learning of associations that are hard to pick up except with this lots of time. So then it becomes much more automatic, and you get a change in function in the basal ganglia that supports more long-term behaviors. And it's this kind of plasticity that I think is really fundamental, and hopefully I think Barbara will follow up. The brain's biological organ. We know lots of that biological organs have trouble with time, but the brain is also very plastic, and these kind of changes that can occur change the way we make decisions, change the neural structures, change how we manage difficult choices in our world, sort of trades off with the biological change with experience and changes in the neural systems. So I'm sort of hoping that's what we're going to focus on as we go through. So I think I've used up more than my 10 minutes, but that's my intro. So should I'm in charge of introducing?
No.
Okay.
I did the one-sentence introductions, and everyone now has bios for everybody except our one speaker.
Are we taking questions now for Sam?
No.
Oh.
Go through all three, then questions.
Oh, okay. Okay. So hi, I'm Barbara Strouk. I'm the science editor of the New York Times, and thanks for coming. And I am not a neuroscientist. I'm a science editor. So I came to this field really because as a human being who's now 60, a few years ago I got, like many of you or many of the people we know, a little worried about my own brain. I started forgetting stuff. I'd go down to the basement and to get something that I needed, and by the time I got there, I'd forget why I was there. I'd think about renting a movie, and my daughter would have to tell me that I'd already seen that movie. So it was worrisome. And at the same time, I had a challenging job. I seemed to be functioning okay. So I wondered what was actually going on, and I started to talk to other people who were my similar age, and I started hearing very similar things. One conversation I remember in particular with a friend of mine who's an editor, runs a big publishing thing, and he was talking about how he had signed up or decided to take piano lessons with his daughter as she was learning. He was going to learn, and he was in his mid-50s, I think, at that point, and he said, he was completely frustrated. He could not learn anywhere near as quickly as his daughter in terms of the notes, playing something new. And yet here he was, he said, and yet I feel like I'm at the top of my game professionally. So I guess that's what intrigued me, was this sort of like, how can both be true? It's true that like the teenagers that I was raising at that time also were not the height of mindfulness. They could forget things too, but they seemed to be forgetting things that they wanted to forget, like telling their parents when they were coming home, or they seemed to be weighing the risk and benefit of forgetting in a way that was different than mine. Mine seemed to be sort of like I'd forget things I'd want to remember. Who are you? What's your name? So I think that's what made me intrigued, was this kind of dichotomy. And I had heard, I think, and had lived with, those of us my age who grew up with John Updike and a lot of the, the midlife crisis, doom and gloom kind of cultural stuff. And so I expected a midlife crisis. I expected to feel that an empty nest would make me feel horrible. It didn't. And so as I looked into all of this, I found out that a lot of the cultural things and a lot of the scientific things that I thought were true simply were not. And there's a lot of new sciences come out, work by Laura Carstensen herself on how we, as we age, tend to focus more on the positive than the negative, was shocking to me, quite interesting. And I was so interested, we're still friends, because because I think it was just so fascinating to me how all these myths that even I had in my own head were kind of upended by this recent science. We now have these long studies, longitudinal studies that have been studying the same people for years now. At a certain point, a few years ago, maybe in the mid-50s, there were a certain number of very smart scientists who decided that this middle age we had now on the planet was a new thing. As one said, almost like studying astrophysics, because we didn't, until we had childhood vaccines and antibiotics, we didn't really have this long stretch in the middle where we're very healthy. And so this is a new thing. And so all of it was kind of intriguing to me. And what are they finding out? And the longitudinal studies do find that well-being increases as we age. Laura's work finds that we kind of look at the world differently, perhaps on purpose. And the neuroscience is also pretty interesting. A lot of the myths that I think have been out there, that we lose 30% of our brain cells as we age, they can go in and count brain cells now, and they find that this is not necessarily the case. There's true, I think it's, to be honest, we have to admit that there are some declines. Processing speed, learning that new piano thing is going to be more difficult for us. That new computer system at work, some of us just run out of the room when they bring the latest one in, but never mind. I mean, I think that what people have found is that we do have some honest declines as we age, particularly through this very healthy middle age. We have enormous gains. I mean, clearly that there is a decline in processing speed, and people used to think that graph, I think, sort of dictated how our brains behave overall. And looking at our skins and our bodies and things, which of course some people are keeping in better shape than they used to too, but people would think that was what our brains were doing too. But as Sam said, our brain is a very plastic organ, and if it's healthy, it can keep learning. In fact, it probably is primed to keep learning through this healthy middle age. And I think the studies now show that we sometimes in this period of time, if we're healthy, we get the gist of arguments better. We're perhaps focusing more on the more positive. We are good problem solvers. There's some very good data that shows that, in fact, our abilities in inductive reasoning are better in the same people that they study it from 40 to 65 than they were in our 20s, which is not hard sell to some kids in graduate school, I know, who think they're the smartest they'll ever be. But it's not necessarily the case. Our brains can continue to develop. That kind of stuff, there's some other data coming out now that is kind of questionable about that. And so, I'm wondering myself if that's still true. But I think the most important thing that I learned in my research about that middle age span in particular is that this is where this giant split happens. There's a huge variability in animals and in humans in terms of how our brains age. And I think that's where the science is trying to figure out why one goes one way, one goes the other. Is it health? Is it heart health? Is it our brains are now considered very much like our hearts. We need oxygen, and we need to think of them that way. So I think the science is trying to figure out in animals, in humans, why do some continue to go on and do fine, and we now know a lot of people in their 90s or 100 who are just as sharp as a tack, and some do not. And what is it? Little strokes. What is it? Is it stimulation? Is it education, which is very highly correlated with brain health as we age? And I'll just tell one little story before I always bring up my aunt. Whenever I come out here, I see her. She lives in Monterey, and she's 88, and she and I were sitting there watching the Super Bowl. It turns out everybody else was gone, and we had this dopey television. We were watching television, and sitting next to it was a flat-screen TV they'd gotten for Christmas and not unpacked yet. And my 88-year-old aunt, who's a widow and has had to be on her own for quite some time, at halftime said, let's not watch Madonna. Let's open up this flat-screen TV and hook it up. And of course, I'm kind of going, okay. And so I really wanted to watch the Super Bowl, actually, but we unpacked it, we hooked it up, and I think, looking back, I was actually thinking about this as she was doing it, and I was thinking that, she was probably weighing the positive of showing her dopey niece that this is possible, that that's a good example, against the negatives of not ever seeing the rest of the Super Bowl or Madonna. So, but we did it. We didn't actually get the cable, but actually the Super Bowl was not on cable. So she's going to have to call Comcast anyhow. But it functioned, and actually the lesson I took away from that, as we do, I think, when we see people at this age do these amazing things, is it's possible. And so I think that's what we really need to figure out in the brain. What makes it possible for some and not for others? How can we affect that? And so that's me.
So good morning, everybody, and I bring a little different element to this wonderful, what I've just heard from both of you. I started the Aging Adult Geriatric Program at Stanford University Medical Center a few years ago, and I came from India looking for answers for my own parents. My father was a brilliant scientist, and I sort of saw exactly what you were just saying, that he was so productive, but then all of a sudden Parkinson's disease kind of got some of the agility and the aspects of his reasoning. And so I just want to be able to introduce a couple of thoughts that I share with my patients. I say I work 24/7 because the hospital is my life. And what I have learned from my patients and their families is just incredible. So you have, at one level, this compelling demographic shift in the history of civilization, unprecedented aging facts. And then you have societal changes, economic changes, healthcare changes, because we are trying to figure out what are we going to do. I'm very blessed that I work with some of my professors who are 90, and they are probably functioning much better. So I tell them the 90 is the new 50. On the other hand, I also have 55 and 60-year-old patients who have chronic disease, have social vulnerability, and have all kinds of issues. And then I look at what this all does for decision making, which is the topic today. What does it mean in terms of making appropriate decisions, whether it's health, economics, planning, children, grandchildren, and so on. The other part that I bring to the table today is I also started the Dementia Support Program. I work very closely with the wonderful physicians you'll hear this afternoon, because you can give somebody a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment, or Alzheimer's, or Lewy body, or vascular dementia. But what does it mean after that? What do you do? Where do you take that diagnostic? How do you translate that into your daily functioning? Does it suddenly mean that you can no longer be functional? You don't drive, you don't do any of those socially? And I have seen people with diagnosis perform wonderfully well in structured environments, but I go back to the whole idea that it takes a village. If you are a family, you have to work together with your family, with your social peers, and then guide policymakers, then guide the economists. And I just wanted to, I sort of diverted a little bit, but I look at one of the models that we're working on, and I'm kind of working along in terms of my research as well, and hopefully come to Laura one day with it, that if you just look at 3 Venn diagrams and you see chronic disease, acute disease, and social vulnerability, and you see them sort of intersect, most of the patients I work with are at that intersection where they have chronic disease, acute disease, and social vulnerability. By social vulnerability, I mean when you start to be afraid where I'm living longer, will I have the money to take care of my needs? Then they start backing down and not investing in good health practices. I don't think I should be doing this or that. How does that impact your later on years? And I'm also part of a lot of discussions in the ICU and the emergency room where I have brilliant family members come together and said, I never spoke with Dad and Mom about what the planning was supposed to be. I never asked him what he wanted. And I think that a part of the education I do is to say that the minute you recognize some non-plasticity of the brain, some part of decision making, talk to your family, ask them what they want. And that takes away the fear of patients. I have a lot of patients who live by themselves alone, children are far away. And I think all of these people are driving who we are today, what it's going to mean in terms of the future. And then one last thing about delirium. I don't know how many of you are here or aware of delirium. Happens to anybody 65 plus who comes for surgery, gets infection. Normal people, that is really an insult, and that helps that impedes progress, that makes longer hospital stays, and there is good research evidence that delirium can impact future decision-making somewhat into dementia. And we can prevent delirium if we work together in the medical center and so on. So that's just my few thoughts here.
We're open to discussion.
A question for Dr. McClure. We're carefully performing volumetric measurements now of the amygdala, the hippocampus, and entorhinal cortex, but we really haven't been looking at the basal ganglia. Do you think there's anything to be learned by looking at volumetrics of the basal ganglia with aging?
Absolutely, right? So I think, probably volumetrics is a challenging measure because it's hard to know exactly what that means. It can change very quickly. If you're a medical student and you're studying for an exam, you can get thicker cortex that then reverts very quickly after the exam finishes. I think we all know that experience.
The reverting part.
Sure, that's measurable, but
So it's hard to know exactly what that means, especially because one thing known about brain development is that you're born with lots of connections between your neurons, lots of axons and dendrites, and there are a huge number of synapses. And one important part of learning is pruning away unnecessary connections. And there is a concomitant change in the volume of different brain structures as a consequence of pruning away unnecessary things and strengthening connections that are valid and real and promote good decision making. So I'm always a little bit timid when it comes to volumetric studies, but in areas like the entorhinal cortex and the hippocampus that are really fundamental for memory, and that furthermore we know change. You grow new neurons as a consequence of good health practices like aerobic exercise. It may be a valid measure of sort of cognitive capacity overall that you can take advantage of, even in the face of sort of normal 1% to 2% annual declines in overall brain health. So a little bit of caution, I guess, overall in terms of brain volume, but yeah, I think it's a good measure. And
you haven't done any volumetrics?
no, I haven't done any volume, and I'm not aware of any volume. I mean, places like the entorhinal cortex, the prefrontal cortex are really obvious initial candidates, just in terms of general cognitive flexibility in the prefrontal cortex and memory abilities in the hippocampus. And those are the ones I'm most aware of. But, so I don't know if Laura knows either, but yeah, but certainly a valid measure, important to take into account. But can I just say one last thing, which is, sorry, and then I'll let us move on, which is, there's this, it's a sort of a long-standing debate in neuroscience, which is how modular is the brain. We like to think of the hippocampus as the memory area and the prefrontal cortex as the sort of cognitive area. But what's really clear, from looking, now that we can measure from the whole brain at once with techniques like fMRI, you see that it's not really the case that any given cognitive function depends on the interaction of many, many brain areas. And so, broadening our search into, good mental health probably depends on good, coherent coordination among many brain areas. And so I think this sort of shift to looking at, health of many different structures is emerging and developing.
Is there any relationship with aging, good aging, and volume of those other brain structures that we know of for sure?
Yeah, we have good evidence of it.
Use the microphone if you would.
Focusing on the basal ganglia, and I was just curious, there's a whole science measuring the volumes of the entorhinal cortex, amygdala, and hippocampus, and I'm just wondering if we're missing something by not doing volumetrics at the basal ganglia.
Can you correlate that with good outcomes or yet? Or?
Oh yeah, when you look at all the parameters, the one that changes immediately before dramatic memory loss is actually the volumes. Mm-hmm. It's not amyloid imaging or neuropsychological testing. It's that memory loss is very important, and that correlates closely with the
at that point.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there's anything to be gleaned by looking at the basal ganglia volumes.
question relates to Barbara's discussion of how people's brains are aging and how there's differences in that. Are there particular things that are known about helping people age better? What kinds of things are there?
Well, as Sam mentioned, aerobic exercise, I think the best science points toward aerobic exercise. You know, the most solid science, I always say there's some squishy stuff here and there, but, you know, exercise seems to be, you know, a slam dunk in terms of the brain. It's like the heart needs oxygen, needs blood. So, and they do find that it does produce new baby brain cells. You know, so how many we get and what they really mean, I think is still a little bit up in the air, but so exercise, sure. You know, in terms of education, has always been correlated, you know, with longevity and also, you know, and I'm not sure anybody quite knows why. I think there's some differing debate about that. I've heard various reasons. One, you know, if you buy into education, you buy into delayed gratification, and that falls in lots of areas of your life. So. Or perhaps it is stimulating your brain to the point where you are keeping those connections going. There's some other theories. One of my favorite that I heard along the way was there's some people who study how older brains learn, and a guy at Columbia has said that you need to sort of shake up the cognitive egg and create this idea of shaking up the patterns that we have created in our brains as we age. Those patterns help us, you know. I have a friend who's a doctor, and she can go to a hospital room and, you know, kind of size up the situation very quickly and have more energy to come to a really creative solution. So I think that helps us. But the patterns can also create some rigidity. And, you know, so as we age, you know, the idea is, you know, how solid the neuroscience is in this, you know, is unclear because the brain is complex. But it does seem there's some data that shows that people seem to feel better and do better in terms of with exercise, and also, as the guy at Columbia said, go talk to people you disagree with, you know, or listen to, you know, if you're on MSNBC, turn to Fox, if only not to make yourself angry or change your mind, but, you know, just sort of open up those brain cells and those connections and kind of, and actually, I think what I learned in my research is to appreciate my brain and what it's good at now. And it is, I think you find yourself, you know, if we're lucky, striving towards things that are the knotty problems, you know, the things that are intractable. And I think maybe our brains, we forget to appreciate this, kind of search for that as we get older. So I think maybe the brains, maybe because it's good for our brains, or maybe because that's what our brains are good at. I don't know. But I notice it in myself, and it's nice.
I'd like to add something to that. I think social engagement is huge, especially for younger adults who are in their 50s, and I've noticed a lot of people say, you know, I'm beginning to have this a little bit of a difficulty in retrieving, because when you are engaged, and we see a huge setback when we move our older patients to long-term care settings where there's no social engagement. There is a longitudinal study that's happening in Mexico and India and Japan, where they found that people with the same kind of cognitive impairment do much better in the other countries than here, because you're probably, you know, you're in a home where there are tons of people, and you're probably fighting with your daughter-in-law, or trying to get your grandchildren out of the home, or cooking, or engaging with other people. So there is that aspect. And the other thing I would like to say is structure. So if you're finding that there are difficulties in certain areas, to be able to have some visual reminders and kind of really working with your brain, people have reported great, you know, sort of some positives to that. So.
Yes, my name is Mike Fernandez, and I want to follow up on a question actually on volumetrics as well. I'm curious as to what research, or you've seen that the role of meditation has on the brain. I've been teaching people how to go ahead and use meditation techniques, and also learn the science of sleep and how that affects your brain. And some of the studies have shown that people who actually meditate can actually, or depending on the meditation they use, influences cerebral blood flow to different parts of their brain, and how that actually helps. Now, we talked about oxygenation and how the importance is of oxygenation, but we live in a very stressful society, and people don't breathe very well. and also the role of cortisol has a tremendous effect on the brain. We see evidence of that now with soldiers returning with PTSD who've been exposed to extreme levels of cortisol, and their hypothalamus has actually decreased, and their brain's actually decreased, by 10%. So my question is really on what research have you seen on the impact of volumetrics using meditation and sleep, and how that affects, our brains over the long term? Thank you.
You're the volume guy.
So the work on meditation, I think, is really fascinating if brand new. And a lot of it's been sort of spurred, with the interaction between the Dalai Lama and Richie Davidson and Wisconsin, which has been spread around through the country. And I've been privileged to have some interaction with that effort. I could say that there's something absolutely real there, although I'm not so certain we have a finger on it neuroscientifically. It's these, one of the main practices and one of the main beliefs in Tibetan Buddhism that I know of is that, things like attention, your ability to maintain attention and focus can really be practiced and trained, and there are different types, and they have different names, like a whole suite of different names. I can't ever pronounce them. But a whole suite of names for different types of attention, and that you could train it and become very adept at it. And I would not be surprised if, I think there are great evidence that this can be trained. These 60-year-old monks would come to the lab and they do mental gymnastics around the undergraduates at Princeton that we were comparing them to. Is incredible. Now, in terms of neuroscience, I'm not sure of any volumetric work on this, but Richie Davidson has shown that one of the theories for how attention works is the ability of different brain areas to coordinate or synchronize in their activity at a specific frequency band, and this allows information to pass between these different structures sort of selectively. And he's shown that, with meditation, with hours of meditation practice among these Tibetan monks, that that synchronization gets better and more robust. And I think we're at early stages, but meditation has become more and more accepted as ways of sort of handling emotional distress, and it has a number of therapeutic benefits. And I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know in terms of again, I don't know what that means in terms of volumes, but in terms of brain function, there are a number of measures now showing that it has benefits, and I'm sort of excited to see how that continues to improve.
I have a little different question, but I think it's primarily for Barbara, and it kind of ties into Ken's talk. And that is when you look at the sort of trends, there are clearly aging population, increased numbers of Alzheimer's, and then when you look at the amount of allocation of resources for studying these diseases and studying diseases and ailments that are associated with age, they actually are going in the other direction. Right. And I guess from sort of the media perspective, we live in a youth culture, we live in a nation that champions youth over age, and notwithstanding the fact that youth don't vote, but the aging population does vote, that seems to be a persistent trend. And I guess the question is, if those perceptions are going to impact allocation of resources over the next decade or so, from your sort of perspective in sort of the inside the media, is that possible to change? Is that just sort of so culturally entrenched that that's just something that will never transcend, and this will be kind of an abiding trend into the future?
In terms of, allocating resources to study aging, you mean?
Both allocating resources to study aging and just sort of the perspective of the political culture more generally.
Yeah, no, I think it's probably, we're not really in a very good place. I mean, I think that, people like Laura and things are sort of sounding the bell, and, Ken and things about what's happening, and, but, what happens is there's not much money out there, and I know Obama came out and, I just was looking at my email a couple days ago, and Obama said we're going to spend so much money on Alzheimer's research and stuff, and of course I was talking to the reporter, and they said, well, this money's already allocated, it's not new money, it's just baloney, really. And so, So they kind of give the perception that we're trying to really dive into this, and we're really not. That being said, there are some real advances in some cases in dementia, so I'm not completely pessimistic, in terms of allocation of research, if they start to get somewhere. The drug companies, of course, are very interested, so they may help in that area at least. We do things like, Jane Brody, who writes for us, just did a series about, how communities can help people as they age, in terms of living in communities and stuff. But again, there's not much money to create beautiful, perfect places for people to age in. So at the moment, I think it's not a very good place to be.
What about curious what the reaction's been to your effort to debunk the midlife crisis?
Well, I think, that's still a narrative that movies like, and books like and things like that. But I think as more of us age and don't find it to be true, it's sort of fading away a little bit, I think. I think maybe, that's my thought anyway. We've all, in my generation, done things 10 or 15 years later, and there's a lot of us. So I think if we all realize that, the midlife crisis was based on very, it was the data is based on, a very small study of artists who actually changed their style in midlife. And, that's really where the data comes from. And from that, we have this entire cultural narrative that we're all going to get depressed and buy little cars and mess around and stuff like that. And I'm sure some of that goes on, but I'm not sure it goes on any more in midlife than any other time.
Yeah, thank you. As we're an aging society, there's more and more concern about legal capacity, hearing about brain studies and different measurings of a person's ability. And of course, the intersection is, of course, how much capacity can you lose and still have legal capacity? And so I'd just like to have maybe a couple of thoughts that would be helpful for us. Thank you.
Sure, go ahead.
Sure. So I think that the question is about legal capacity, and I think there's going to be a panel in the afternoon. But we at the hospital setting are constantly being asked that question in terms of diminishing of capacity if there has been a diagnosis of, say, mild cognitive impairment or any of the dementias. And you really have to have a neuropsych testing and a set of constructs in place before you can say that such a person should not be either driving or there needs to be, in terms of advanced directives or durable power of attorney, all of those. So there is a lot of protection. And then this other part of decision making, which I was just talking to Hank this morning, is that what do you think about decision making where somebody just does not want to follow best practices? 65 or 70-year-old patient who doesn't want to follow, the practices laid down by either the physician or the family. Do you call that impaired decision making? So this is an area where we tread very, very gently. And I just want to give you a quick example where we had a very difficult situation where somebody who did have a couple of mini strokes and did have some, white spots in the MRI, but really did not go through any specific testing and a proper diagnosis. And then that person was sort of forced into a higher care situation like an assisted living. And when he stood up and said, "Why are you taking my decision-making ability away to live independently?" caused a lot of problems. Because again, he is lucid, he is able to. So it's a very gray area, and it can be so difficult to determine that. I mean, when you want to drive and you've had some problems and so on. So I think the way it's set up, and I think Dr. Longo will probably talk about that, and maybe Michael Gilfix, about the whole set of issues that are around it that will lead to, capacity determination in the legal sense. So.
I know too. I mean, I think it's a mess out there. It's a mess, and from what I know, and I'm a little bit worried watching the medical stuff. I mean, it's really hard to diagnose dementia or stroke or capacity and stuff like that. And I am a little worried about the flip side, as you're talking about, a little bit of overdiagnosis.
Yes.
That as we get in and say, well, this brain scan says that you have early Alzheimer's or whatever. we are a society that likes to say what things are, and I'm a little bit worried on that end that we're going to go the other way. Maybe.
So I would always take the $1,200, but more often than I would like, I choose the piece of cake. And what I'm thinking is, even though we have networks rather than modules, it seems that we have alternative networks or orchestrations for decision making. And I'm wondering where we are in the state of the art when we see an older person's decision-making abilities decline. Are we able to offer them therapies to start engaging different networks or strategies from whichever ones they are relying on up to that point, kind of like when we help rehabilitate a stroke victim? And are we learning about delusion and its implications for later and taking that kind of knowledge to inform these therapies?
I'd love it if you commented on this, because of the bilateralization you write about so elegantly. Do you want to?
No, you can start. Go ahead.
So it's true. I mean, we know from there's a lot of data. One of the big ideas about the brain, the way the brain works, is that there's a lot of redundancy, right? There's many different ways to solve a problem, and we're pretty immune to pretty severe brain damage, right? Or brain insults. So things you can see this even in the case of like traumatic brain injuries. A severe brain injury, you could recover most functions. It takes a little while, and so when something gradual occurs, like there's a gradual decline in the health of the cells in our brain with age, then there's bound to be compensatory changes in how our brain deals with problems. And this is just known. At first, it was a big mystery because you'd expect that if areas like the prefrontal cortex show declining function, that there should just be decline in the in brain activity as you measure. But it turns out it's not really the case. There's actually an increase with age. And you recruit more and more areas of the prefrontal cortex to solve a problem. And the degree to which you do so, people do so, correlates with their overall intelligence. So the more they recruit these new systems relative to younger people, the better they tend to do. And this is really kind of encouraging way to think about the brain and plasticity. Is, we can know it can subsume different structures, can subsume many different functions. And our ability to sort of, maybe by shaking things up, to sort of recruit different systems, solve problems in new ways, can give us a lot of perseverance in the face of the Father Time, I guess.
I think there are some, I'll just add a little bit, I think that, there is some work being done too to try to figure out how to train that brain. One reason it may correlate with education in terms of being able to recruit more parts of your brain is that your brain is used to going up and grabbing that prefrontal cortex when it needs to. And, when it's dealing with complex ideas in its work or leisure time or whatever, that, those pathways are clear. And so they are, there's a guy at Columbia who was trying to use a video game actually to teach learning how to do that, how to go up and make sure those pathways are clear and grabbing that prefrontal cortex, which is a really good thing to grab when you need it. So they're going to try and figure out ways to sort of train our brains to do that, which would be great. Beyond crossword puzzles, probably.
Hi, I'm Mike Gilfix. I provide legal services privately, and I sort of feel like I've been doing a long-term kind of anecdotal study on the issues that you guys have been talking about, because over the years, something that I've observed and drawn some conclusions actually that follow directly from many of your comments, that early on I thought it was necessary, important, vital to go into the homes of older individuals who are having legal issues, long-term care issues, go to their home, it'll be more comfortable for them, they'll do better. And I've absolutely concluded that it's just that the opposite is true, that when we can get them to leave their home and come to our office, a professional environment where the environment changes for them, and often there is a diagnosis of a dementia. And, so the family members and other caregivers start to draw their set of conclusions and start to treat them a certain way. And then when they meet with us, we work very hard to be respectful. They're the focus, not the kids, not the caregivers. Mm-hmm. So, it's the change of environment and the way that we address them. Mm-hmm. So my question then becomes, if you're aware of any, if there's any practical application of that kind of thinking as you all do your research, as you think about lessons in policy that we would be evolving to make us more able to work with individuals who have maybe some preliminary diagnoses even.
Oh, maybe, so.
So from a neuroscience standpoint, there's a little bit known, right? So about very basic things like being isolated socially, and that causes increase in stress hormones and damage to the brain, and this causes a number of cascading problems. So I have no reason, I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's much richer, like you suggest. I was also getting reminded of this conversation I had on the way in today. I didn't catch your name, but we were talking about exactly these issues, like if you're older and you get treated like an incompetent child. I'm bastardizing your terms, but anyway, then is it surprising that you respond sort of in kind? I mean, and is it about aging, or is it about our societal attitudes and the structure and the environment that we find? And there's not much neuroscience on it, but I would not be surprised at all, and I totally believe and I anticipate that the environment you find yourself in, and we know it influences behavior at every other stage of our life and every other environment we find ourselves in. So how can it not be true also with age?
So just to comment on what you said, Mike, is that we see this on a daily, probably an hourly basis in the hospital setting, where we are speaking with families and older adults. And I think the medical profession is moving towards speaking with the patient and not to the patient and not to the family about the patient who's lying on the bed. So I agree with you that I have seen that when you do summon and you respectfully ask them questions, that those parts of the brain that are needed. Because if you look at dementia, every dementia has its own presentation. I mean, I haven't seen one like the other. And I think that long-term memory stays intact. There are days when patients are extremely lucid. So maybe by channelizing everything and putting them in the focus, may bring them with greater analysis and clarity. On the other hand, there is also something to be said about overwhelming patients. So I have families who will try to do, let's get Dad back on the computer programming that he did so well, and let's get 10 guests today, or let's take him to Arizona. And that overwhelming stimuli can also be detrimental for somebody who's fragile, where the brain is fragile. So either way.
Well, I'd like to know, too, from Mike, I guess maybe you'll talk about this later, I mean, how that screws up your assessment of that person. If they come, I know my father had some stroke dementia, but he, this cognitive reserve, if you have a pretty good brain, he was an engineer and he had a pretty good brain, he could fake it, when he wanted to or when he had to. And so it was really confusing to try to figure out how bad off he was and tell jokes and things like that till he was dying. And so it's so difficult, I think.
So it may be that my aging brain just didn't pick it up. But I'm curious, in terms of normal aging, non-dementia, how does our decision-making actually change? I think in my own sense is that I've become a little more cautious in my decision-making as I've gotten older, but I'm not sure whether that's A, a bad thing, or B, has to do with anything other than the experiences I've accumulated of my predictions about the future turning out to be wrong. So is there good evidence about how our decision-making processes actually do change in the course of normal aging? And if so, how do we change?
There's some new studies I saw recently which talked about how older and younger, I think up to like 60 to 86 compared to younger, they were just as good at making good, quick decisions, intuitive decisions in terms of weighing, give you a lot of data and pick the best outcome really quickly, and the older people did just as well as the younger. So, and I think there's a lot of science that actually shows that we can do well. We do get the gist better. We do see the big picture and things, but we might be not so good on the complex. Give me a lot of healthcare, information that I need to sort through and things like that, and making those kinds of decisions are a little bit more daunting. And in terms of emotional stuff, in terms of more cautious and things like that, I certainly am too, and I think maybe that comes from what we always call experience, which of course, as I always remind people, doesn't build up in our brains, it builds up, in our knees, it builds up in our brains, so it is changing our brains even as we're older. So, but I know emotionally these days what's interesting to me is that I no longer know what is good luck or bad luck aside from death or illness or something, I'm not quite sure, and so I'm a little bit more sanguine about life, I think, in terms of the decisions I make too, so.
Well, two things I'd like to say. One is a lot of, if you try to break down decision-making sort of as an economist would, right, there's a lot of stereotypes that have been, or just assumptions that have been made, which are just kind of breaking down now that people are testing it sort of rigorously and trying to put some neuroscience behind it or establish it across a population. So Laura, with one of her grad students, recently published a paper. It used to be assumed that, I can't remember exactly the way it goes because I erased the stereotype, but that as you get older, you get more risk averse. But they find there's no difference. Really, there was another idea for the chocolate cake was that as you get older, your time horizon shortens. So, forget the future. Just eat all the cake I want now. And that doesn't seem to really be true. A lot of sort of these old, just simple notions just don't seem. And I think we're in an exciting phase now, trying to rebuild it. Right. Another thing, which I think is a really critical aspect of this, is changing strategies. Right. And Laura's work is really one way of capturing that is sort of just put it in that guise, right? We have different needs and desires as we get older, and when you're young and everything just seems so expensive, you behave differently, you explore the world much more, and you just open to more new experiences and just doing things for the sake of figuring out what the world's out there. And then as you get older, your strategies change as a consequence of just different time horizons. And I'm not sure how that leads to things like perceptions of cautiousness, but I wouldn't be surprised if, certainly strategies change and how you behave therefore changes as well.
So do we even have good metrics for thinking about decision making? Are there particular tests of decision making that are well accepted, or categories of decision making?
So certainly the ability to juggle and bring in new information, juggle information rapidly and make quick responses, great psychological test for that, right? Just have people make speeded reaction time tests or throw them a bunch of words and see how quickly they can recall them. Really easy to measure, and there's nice declines, starting mid-20s or so.
So 35-year-olds get to be aging on that one, huh?
Yeah.
Good.
Sad.
Right. And there are, other things like, the accumulation of information to be able to draw, themes and gists and better are just harder to measure. Things like vocabulary we know build up, and this is a good sign for this kind of ability. But I think some of the most exciting work does, David Lapeson's recent work in economics, showing that people make the best financial decisions in a number of domains. Age 56? Is that the magic?
I think it is.
53? 53. So I get a few more years. But anyway, but those are difficult to sort of break apart. What is it that's causing people to make the best complex financial decisions at that point? It's a hard thing to break. We know it's true, but why is it 53 and what's contributing to that?
So I wanted to go the opposite direction just for a minute, because an earlier question asked about meditation, and we talked about the importance of focus and attention. So I'm wondering if anyone has studied the younger generation now, whose attention span must be less than 60 seconds. They're constantly texting, talking on the phone, watching a video. I doubt that very many spend an hour with everything turned off and their mind just on one task. And so I'm really curious to know if anyone's even thinking about studying the long-term ramifications of that kind of activity on potentially cognitive decline in later years. You know, if you looked at 40-year-old nows who are addicted to their BlackBerries, you know, could we actually be having a dementia curve that drops down in terms of its appearance in the population? It's just random thoughts.
You know, I don't know, you want to talk about the neuroscience. I personally have not seen a lot of good science that talks about, that shows that this, you know, this overload of multitasking is really detrimental. I don't think we know yet. I think it's, you know, too early to know. And the stuff that we have so far, we've actually at the newspaper even written some series and stuff on this, and certainly distracted driving. There are certain areas that, you know, where death results and things like that. But in terms of overall, you know, kids that are good at video games sometimes become good robotic surgeons. I mean, I don't think we really know yet. And I think that even in my own newspaper, some cases, you know, we've written about, I shouldn't say this for the universe, but that it's more detrimental than we really know. It's really early, and I mean, if you think about being, I mean, I had 2 kids, you know, parents, men and women, but, you know, traditionally women have been multitasking for centuries, and I'm not sure it's all that different, maybe, but addiction can happen, but addiction can happen to anything, and addiction is bad. So it's a level, but that's my view anyway.
So the neuroscience, I'm really excited. I think this is a cool area. I mean, it's interesting. But there's two famous areas of neuroscience I know about. One is people who play the first-player shooter video games where they run around and they're being bombarded by people attacking them from everywhere on the screen, and they're like, you know, running for their life for like 8 hours a day. Anyway, they tend to have better abilities in some ways, you know, better abilities to pick up information in their peripheral visual system, just sort of generally, and that people are kind of excited about that there may be some benefits, cognitive benefits to playing video games a lot. And then there's some work that just came out here at Stanford. This is all very early, right? So some work came out here at Stanford by Anthony Wagner and Yes, thank you, who showed that people who constantly using Facebook and surfing the web and watching TV and doing everything all at once, you put them on these kind of simple cognitive batteries, like I was talking about, you know, hold this piece of information in mind and then do this, right? They just don't seem to be as good. They're more easily distractible on these very basic cognitive tests. They, you know, all the sort of things you would expect. So it's just self-reporting. How often do you tend to be, you know, medium multitask, and then correlate that with a number of just very basic cognitive abilities. And there's a correlation. Is it causal? It's hard to know.
Chicken and egg problem.
Yeah. It's kind of exciting, but you can imagine that, you know, you train yourself up to always be looking for something crazy going on in your environment and switching here and there and all around, and that this may imprint itself on your brain somehow.
Especially if you say there's good evidence that meditation and focus and attention are actually important. You know, I think it'd be a waste for us to kind of be aware of this potential problem and not at least set up some very good ways of, you know, if nothing else, just doing some longitudinal studies and thinking about it. And
early stages, but yeah.
Thank you.
I have one, I think, positive point about aging. I think in the Chinese society, it goes with wisdom, right? As we get older, we become wiser. And I surely have the personal experience of being much wiser now than I was like 40 years ago. So, or even 30 years ago. So how do the neuroscientists go and look for that? And especially with the aging population, I wonder how many of you here, a lot of you are aging, right? So, statistics, here's a scientific approach. A non-scientific kind of a test. How many of you think you are wiser now that you are older? Even though you have lost a lot of your physical abilities, maybe. How your brain is much sharper. I mean,
I think so.
See, I think absolutely.
I don't know that it's sharper, but I do think I'm wiser.
No, I think also.
I'm not sure I'm right.
No.
Because you're
I
wise.
think oftentimes one is right, because I think it comes with experience, right? You have seen a lot of different scenarios. Like I advise students here for the last 30 years, and I think I've become wiser every single year. I mean, so I think how do you study that, the neuroscientists? And I think older people always think everything goes downhill. But I think this is one aspect that doesn't go downhill. It goes uphill. So how do you do that? How do you study that?
Well, I think it has been studied in many ways, at least in beginning ways, as you were talking about, older people recruit more of their brains if they need to, Laura's work showing how we are focused on the positive because perhaps we want to in an unconscious way.
You see the pictures more clearly, I think.
And I think
what's
that,
important,
what
what's
they see,
trivial.
it makes sense that we have patterns and connectivity built up in our brain.
Right, exactly.
We have some declines, but the connectivity probably helps us more than the declines hurt us for a long time. So, again, when you talk to people, as you say, we all feel this way. We just forget to talk about it. And, I have a friend who became a poet in her mid-50s, and she said it's the only time I could see how the pieces of the world, fit together and create poetry out of it. And I think that's what we need to appreciate. Our brains do that.
Right. I think in dealing with the older population, you always think, oh, you're getting weaker, you need more help, etc. I think one of the positive things is to make use of what the older people have that the young people don't have, and that is wisdom, right? And so if you can get the older population to be more engaged in using what they're able to do, I think a lot of them will be much happier.
Do you think in your Chinese culture that actually happens?
Yes. I hope they're not losing it. They're not learning too fast from the West that youth trumps age. So I think a lot of people think that as you get older, because young people have a tendency to listen a little bit more, I surely have experience with the students here, that they feel you're older, so you probably have more experience, you're probably wiser, and so they will talk to you about their problems.
So I would like to address that by saying that there is a huge amount of theoretical and, of course, other academic work towards this about, especially if you look at the Chinese and the Japanese and Indian culture, where I think that if you define wisdom, when you say they are wiser, what do we really mean? Does it mean that people are actually listening to you? You have a sense of self-engagement. I mean, how many times you have individuals who have contributed so much, and you're right, we stereotype and say, oh, you're aging, but we are not hearing them, we are not listening. So how much of this wisdom that you are being attributed to is actually people responding to you, you are responding to them, you're in a meaningful dialogue. And I think that, coming back to Hank's other question about normal aging, I think we are all doing very well, and we continue to progress emotionally, physically, we are doing very well, unless something traumatic happens. I mean, if God forbid somebody has a stroke or a heart attack or something, then that defines how you progress. But wisdom, I think that if you have the ability to contribute and you have people listening to you and you're in a self-engaging or in an engagement kind of a module, then that's going to just make it better and better. But many people are isolated. They do not have that ability to teach or educate or share. And I think that's where we are finding those difficulties. So your students are making you feel wiser. You are wiser. But do we all have that? I mean, in India, where I come from, people still listen to you. But are we listening to people here?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing we all know for sure, right? Aging does occur, so we all slowly lose our physical abilities. Right. I think we're not as fast. But I think mentally, I'm not too sure what you lose. Probably you lose some and you gain some. Yeah. And I think this is something that all of us need to be aware of. So that I hope the neuroscientists can get some real physiological data as to convince people.
Wisdom.
Pardon?
It's hard to measure wisdom, so you can...
Exactly. So that's your challenge, right? How do you study that? I mean, there must be parts of the brain that actually become better as you age, right? Not always scanning, whatever techniques.
I think Sam's right, what Sam's saying, I think. In order to start looking at this, you have to be able to define wisdom and measure it and quantify it in order to start looking at it. And I hope there are people working on that, although I don't envy them that task.
I also think it's more of a part of our culture than we oftentimes give America credit for, because we love our Hollywood. But we also, I think a company would be. I was just thinking about Mark Zuckerberg and his terrible antics in that movie, but you know, they hired a CEO to make the decisions, important decisions for him, and you know, he would never hire a 25-year-old CEO, even if they may be sharper at, you know, some cognitive task. And we implicitly somewhere in our culture we know that wisdom and good decision making requires experience, and it's something that takes years to develop. And you know, we see that at the heads of our big companies.
I think Mark Zuckerberg is 26, right?
Yeah, and the CEO of that company who keeps him from
Very
doing.
wise.
But I mean, this is sort of you know, Steve Jobs got kicked out of Apple for being a young jerk, and then he came back and is a wise older man, right? And then, so you know, it's implicit in our culture. I wish it were more emphasized, but I think, you know, some of this efforts that Barbara's doing, trying to debunk some of these myths and the changing the cultural narrative associated with aging, I think is a really important, both for mental health, for valuing of age and wisdom altogether.
I do think it's amazing. It is weird in this culture. I mean, we value it. You know, you can't be president till you're a certain age, and you know, lawyers and judges and things we turn to be wise and older and stuff. But then we tell teachers, you know, when they're 50, please leave. You know, and your life is over. And so we just don't seem to be able to get everybody into that category. It's weird.
Time for two more questions.
So I have a question about variability within the individual. I mean, most of the studies seem to be variability across a population. A couple of times today it was mentioned, and certainly anecdotally, whenever you speak to somebody who has interactions with an older person who might have onset of dementia, there's always they have the good days, they have the bad days. Some days they're lucid, some days they're not. Has there been any studies sort of within the individual to try to identify why the good days, why the bad days? Because it seems like if they can have the good days, then it's not like the capability has been eliminated. Is there any science behind any of that?
I don't really know of any. I don't know if they're zeroing in enough to know. Do you have some?
Well, it's a part of that question. So, for example, all of the people who are involved in the dementia research, and we are part of a couple of studies that why the good days and why the bad days, which goes back to the variability. So specific to dementia, I can't say that for any other cognitive or other normal aging issues, that triggers kind of cause certain days to be good and bad, because we have patients and families keep sort of a narrative as to which day went well, so we could identify some of those variables, and triggers can cause stress. And because memory is I remember learning this from my professor 20 years ago, that can you imagine being without memory? If memory is weak, it can be the most frightening domain of your life. So if, for example, you have whatever the brain structure, the loss of memory, plus then you have certain triggers which overwhelm you, and then that escalates in our patient population to good days and bad days, which is agitation, confusion, repetition, you know, whatever the behavior you call it. And we find that sometimes when we are able to kind of control that, so the things we tell our families, agree and redirect, or keep it simple, keep the structure going. But don't take away still have those meaningful, wise discussions, still have engagement. So that's the only way we can answer. There is some body of research going on which are actually looking at patient days, good and bad, and trying to see what the variabilities are, sometimes whether it's good, you know, oxygen or good exercise. Exercise, we always come back to exercise and walking, so. I mean, that's sort of a limited way of answering.
How about fatigue?
Fatigue and stress. I think fatigue, you know, tasks, for example, people who are still trying to work even though they have a mild cognitive impairment. We are studying a cohort of about 100 of them. They all report that at the end of the day, when fatigue sets in, that's a great implication, and stress sets in the whole day, too many variables, too many stimuli, they perform much worse. So I think, but the fact that they still have it tells you that they still have it.
Right, it seems like if you could identify that variable, might help you identify how to help people over the longer term.
Thank you.
Just very quickly, thanks very much. You've actually, a lot of people have addressed all the points that I wanted to make as I was getting up. I was going to say there is some literature about wisdom. Stephen Hall has written a book that sort of compiles some of that, but it's a little fuzzy for my tastes, I think because it's so poorly defined. And then Jonathan Haidt is a social psychologist at the University of Virginia, who's written a book called The Happiness Hypothesis that deals with positive psychology, but a lot about wisdom as well. I think those are good places. And there's also a wonderful book called Losing It by blanking on his name. I think it's Ian Miller.
Bill Miller.
Bill Miller, yeah, William Ian Miller, yeah. It's really good, and he focuses on the whole point of, he's basically chronicling minor cognitive problems that he's having. But I think the big points that he makes are, first of all, you need a sense of purpose, and secondly, you need to feel socially like you have a sense of meaning in some social dimensions. And I think that's part of what we're talking about as well here, is not just the individual, but the individual in relation to family, to culture. I mean, it's great to have wisdom, but what if you have wisdom and you're just sitting in your apartment all day and no one wants to talk to you? What happens then? And so I think there's a social dimension to what we're talking about here that's very important as well, but that's sort of self-obvious. Anyway, thank you.
Please join me in thanking our panel.